The anterior delt and the lateral head are by far the most difficult muscles to train, and most people do it horribly, horribly wrong. For example, most people will do a shoulder press that doesn't even go through an effective range of motion. They'll start the movement with the anterior delt already in a shortened position and just shorten it even more. It's ridiculous. Or they do an incline variation like this for their lateral head, which is something I was teaching 4 years ago. Look at how young and dumb I look. I have aged a lot, like a fine bag of shit. What I've learned along the way is that's actually a great exercise for your rotator cuff muscles. It sucks for your lateral head. The more you dig into the research around internal moment arms of dead grandmas, you realize that the first bit of abduction is mostly the rotator cuff muscle, specifically the supraspinatus. So, yeah, I was giving bad advice, but at least we got your rotator cuff muscles stronger. What do you want? I was young and dumb. One of the main reasons your side delts are such tricky bastards to train is because these rotator cuff muscles are more involved than most people realize. Here is a fascinating study where they did a nerve block that affected all three heads of the delt and then had the participants test their abduction strength at different angles, and what they found is they retained 75% of their strength in the initial range, and all the way up to 120 degrees they retained 25%, meaning that it's not what we previously thought where the first 30 degrees is your rotator cuff muscles and then it's your delt. It is a working relationship throughout. And the reason people have such a hard time training their anterior delts is because when you move your arm through flexion, which is just a front raise, you would think that'd be a lot of anterior delts because it's based upon the line of action, internal moment arms, it's the clavicular head of your pec. Damn it. So I read through all the case studies that had anything to do with the delts. That way we can figure out the absolute best exercises that are backed by science so you didn't have to. I mean, you can go through and read all of them, but they're not a great read. They're no zoo books. That was such a good commercial. So let's first start out with the front raise and see if we can redeem it. The fibers of the clavicular head of your pec moving through this path, which is just a classic front raise, are better flexors than your anterior delt. So this movement is a D, maybe even a D minus. And I would bet you had the same idea that I did. Let's just move away from the pec towards scaption or even the frontal plane, and that'll isolate the anterior delt more. The problem is, this case study will back it up, but common sense will tell you the more you move in that direction, you're basically just doing abduction. So you're going to bring in the lateral head, which also sucks. But we can save this dumpster fire of an exercise because there's one thing we haven't factored in yet, and that's the orientation of your humerus. We know that when you pronate or internally rotate your humerus, you're going to get more lateral and even posterior fibers. Now, when you supinate it, that's where we're going to isolate that anterior delt. But I still probably wouldn't use dumbbells. The best I've found is with cables. And yeah, it's a pain in the ass to get into. Externally rotate those shoulders, aim at 45-ish degrees, a little greater. Let those delts stretch and pull in straight up. Take us from a D minus to a B plus. And I know someone's going to say, yeah, but I can see your biceps are really involved. That's an isometric contraction. If you give a shit about those, you're an idiot. Say you're somebody that's stuck at home with limited equipment. You could do the same thing with dumbbells on an incline, but make sure you're not pulling in. That's going to be your chest. Supinate and drive out and away. And it sucks just as much. Next, let's talk about pressing, because I feel like a lot of people press in a way that's not as effective as it could be. They go full external rotation, flare those elbows out, and press as heavy as they can because obviously it puts a little hair on your taint. It feels good. One of the problems with pressing in external rotation like this is you're bringing in your lateral head. That's why you feel stronger. You initiate the movement, not with your anterior delt, but by abducting up. And the second thing is we're not putting that anterior delt at an optimal length under load. I don't care if your team full range of motion or partial reps at long lengths. Doesn't matter. We both can agree that shorter is not better. So if you really want to stretch the delt, it isn't here. You got to follow the line of action. It's here. So for me, the classic shoulder press, doesn't matter if it's dumbbell, barbell, Smith, they're all a C. It's one of the reasons I bought this machine right here, which, side note, does anybody know why companies now don't even factor in proper biomechanics? They just make shiny shit. And even worse, the companies that did figure it out stopped making the good shit. Now, if you're somebody that gets great results with classic shoulder presses, don't listen to me. But the fact that you're watching this video means that you're probably a lot like me and just said, oh, I don't need to train them that much because I get a lot on chest day. But in reality, I just hated to train them because they would either get hurt or not grow. So fuck them. The only way to really effectively put that anterior delt at length is by moving through the sagittal plane. And I know the first thing that's going to go through your odd-shaped head is, I thought there was going to be a lot of upper pec. Everything changes. The internal moment arms change when you bend your arm. So this is the absolute best way to press. And I know everybody's not going to have this beautiful machine, but you can do the same thing with a Smith by setting up the bench at roughly 60 degrees, grabbing closer with your hands, pinching those shoulder blades back and down, getting into a deep stretch of the anterior delt. And when you press, only engage high enough to flex your anterior delts. Don't let it jump into your triceps. The same applies for dumbbells, but I'll set the bench up a little bit higher because I can dictate the angle by arching my back and either press with a hammer grip or a supinated grip, because then I feel like I can get a little bit more stretch. Same thing, don't let it jump into your triceps. And you guessed it, same but different for a traditional barbell press. Those three exercises, those variations, to me are all S tier. And really, any machine or variation you can think of that factors all of those things in, being working in the sagittal plane, also allowing you to change the angle of your body because your body has a natural mechanism for counterbalancing itself. And in this case, if you're straight up, it's your traps, so we don't want those involved, so we want to tilt back. And then finally, stopping short of jumping into your triceps. Most everything will allow you to do that. So if you can find a machine like that, it's an S tier. And I know that comes off simplistic, only press in that plane of motion and do that single front raise variation, but in my experience and research, that's what works best. So you can continue to do those random other exercises, but know that they probably suck. I don't even know why I'm doing this. I just thought it would look cool. That's a dumb idea. Let's talk side delts. Now, if you're somebody that lives in fear of jacking your humeral head into your acromion, then the best way to create the most subacromial space is by retracting your scaps, pointing your thumb to the ceiling, and moving through the scapular plane. But that won't do shit for you. I just felt like I had to tell you that, because every time I talk about a variation that does slightly decrease subacromial space, people get their balls tied in a knot. Don't freak out. The truth is, shoulder impingements during side laterals are less about poor or improper form and more likely an indication that the rotator cuff muscles or other muscles involved in scapular movement are not functioning properly. Additionally, some people are just predisposed to shoulder impingements, meaning that they have less subacromial space to start with. They are fucked from the start. Hopefully that's not you. Because honestly, the effective way to do these is almost the exact opposite of the quote-unquote safe way. So let's go back to the standard side lateral, palms neutral, arms come out to the side, D+ of an exercise. The first thing we're going to do to make it better is internally rotate the humerus, pronate those palms as much as possible. And yes, that does slightly decrease subacromial space, but your supraspinatus is not going to dry hump the roof of your acromion because of it, because in reality, just abducting your arm decreases subacromial space. So stop freaking out. The reason we're internally rotating is to align the specific deltoid fibers we want to target. I've shown this in a previous video, but the actual fibers that originate on the lateral part of the acromion, the ones whose line of action would directly abduct your arm to the side, is a very small percentage, which means your side delt actually is mostly composed of anterior and posterior fibers that surround it. So our goal here is to line up those lateral fibers with the adjacent posterior and anterior fibers and optimize their engagement through the lateral raise. Why is this so hard to explain? You would think side laterals would be easy, but it's like fucking calculus. To support this even further, there's been research that shows that when you internally rotate, you get less involvement from your supraspinatus, which is the dominant rotator cuff muscle involved in abduction. So it shortens its internal moment arm, therefore putting more emphasis on the deltoid itself to do the damn thing. We're also going to ditch the frontal plane and move towards the scapular plane. And at times, I'll actually move even slightly in from that because it's more natural on the shoulder joint. This will actually help us regain some of the clearance under the acromion that we lost from internal rotation. And we're going to do one more thing. And I don't think I've ever talked about this because it's hard to verbalize all the weird things you do during an exercise. But before you even start, you're going to protract your scaps, which is just flaring your lats, and that's your starting position. What this does is that it starts the movement right where the deltoid becomes the dominant driver of abduction, skipping that initial portion, which is predominantly your rotator cuff muscles. And it also lets you stretch those lateral fibers, which I know sounds crazy because most of the time you think you have to cross your body and do some weird deep stretch, which doesn't even make sense because as you pull into that, you're going to pass those rotator cuff muscles, then go back to the delt. Just try it and it'll make sense. What we're basically doing is using our lats as a wedge and letting the force of gravity in that dumbbell pull on those lateral fibers. So Frankensteining that into one exercise, we're internally rotating, we're on the scapular plane, even slightly in at times, and we're protracting those scaps to use our lats as a wedge to stretch against, and that for me is one hell of an S-tier exercise. So it doesn't matter if you live with your mom and you have little to no equipment, you could take 2 of her vibrators, internally rotate, and before you know it, you'd have great shoulders. And just so we're on the same page, those concepts are things I use on all of my side delt training exercises. For example, this machine side lateral, hard to screw up. I don't care how old you were before your mom let you take off that leash backpack, you can't screw these up. Inherently, they are a B+. But the way I turn this into an S-tier exercise is by doing them unilaterally. That allows me to internally rotate, flare that lat, tilt slightly back, so now I have more of a stretch on that delt. I'm also turned slightly sideways, so I'm in the scapular plane, and then I can pull up from there, and you can see it already sucks. Pretty bad. So let's revisit this exercise, because like I mentioned, I think it's ridiculous because it basically works in the range of motion that's predominantly rotator cuff muscles, but I'm open to being wrong because the more I learn, the dumber I get. So if I had to steelman this exercise, I would say the one good thing it does is it changes the angle of resistance. But if that's the only reason, then why not just take a cable, bring it up to knee level, now you have the same exact thing, but better. Speaking of cable side laterals, I don't care what kind of awful form you have, they are inherently an A-tier exercise and everyone should do them. But again, the same principles apply, and if you want to make them that much better, then all you have to do is the same thing I've been showing you this whole time, internally rotate, change the angle so you can line up those fibers you want to target. I don't care if you're doing it behind your back or in front of you, flare that lat, it's better. So much better. In my last video, people thought I was talking shit about Dr. Mike because I said that anybody that goes above 90 degrees on a side lateral is an idiot. Let me be very specific. This has nothing to do with him. He's not wrong. The delt can generate the most amount of force at 120 degrees. That's not my point. The reason I'm not a fan of it is because we know that your ability to shorten a muscle as much as possible has really nothing to do with growth. If that was the case, then your 17-year-old high school self that was doing 21s all the time, make sure fucking do a shitload of the ones at the top, you would have got a lot bigger. The second thing is most people don't have a mind-muscle connection to their delt, let alone knowing what muscles to engage to be able to manipulate their scapula as they go through that full range of motion instead of just shrugging their shoulders up and engaging their traps. I know you, that's what you would do. And finally, that level of abduction is going to engage your lower traps, which, knowing you probably engage the rest of your traps and screw everything up, and the rest of your workout is going to suck balls. Because again, I know you, you're not doing great. And if you haven't got a chance to buy them yet, there's 2 new 30-minute programs out. One for people that have access to a full gym and one for people that are stuck in their garage. And they're both horrible. It's basically all the principles that I've taught today and everything I've learned over the past so-and-so months. Blah, blah, blah. They're linked below.